what to do after introductions like that. And now I've got three things to juggle. I've got the microphone here, got my clicker, and I've got to worry about what my face is doing while I'm talking to you. So I'm going to lose at least one of those three several times during this presentation. And I want to get right down to it because, like she said, I've got way too much information. I always do, but especially when I get nervous, I tend to over-prepare. So we're never going to get through all of this. That's fine, though. You can download the presentation afterward or email me for it or anything you want to do. I'm here to share. I'm here to help. Two quick warnings, though. Number one, for those of you who have ever been in my presentations before, raise your hand. Okay, a lot of you out there, this should not be a surprise then. I tend to talk very fast. I have that hyperverbal side of autism. And I'm going to go through a lot of slides. I'm going to go through them really quickly, and they're really dense, and I'm not going to cover a lot of what's on the slides because I figure you guys are capable of reading that. So I'm sorry, and please don't write in your comments on my speech, he spoke too quickly, because I'm sorry, I warned you, all right? And then, second warning, my 14-year-old son with autism was watching me put this together, and he was like, Dad, you can't show that. I'm like, well, why? I'm trying to add things that I think will spice it up, and he's like, because those memes are stale, Dad. And I was like, I'm obviously old, and he was like, all your memes are old people memes. So that's the other warning I had to tell you. That's one of his special interests. So, without further ado, some of you probably saw this quote. Let's see if I can get there. John Elder Robinson, he was at IMFAR with us just a couple years back, giving his speech. Got to give him a hug, meet him. He's the guy who wrote Look Me in the Eye. And he's on national boards for autism research, and he said, you guys, you know, we've done all this great research on genetics and on etiology and all this stuff, but what are we doing to actually help with the lived experience? It's time to start focusing on that. And I'm totally with John. And so to represent the lived experience, they picked me. And Lori's like, would you be willing to do it? And I was like, yes, of course, because of course I can tell you exactly what day-to-day life is like for every single person on the autism spectrum. All 150 million of us worldwide. I totally got that covered. So obviously, I'm representing my version of the lived experience. To steal from Temple Grandin, it's life the way I see it, right? But I am going to use other people's writing, other people I've talked to, students I've taught, to try and broaden that out. But really, you're going to get my perspective on this. And I'm born on Kodiak Island, Alaska, like they said. I'm a program director at Scenic View Academy, where we help young adults live, work, and thrive with autism. I work at UVU. I was appointed by the governor to the Utah Developmental Disabilities Council, where I'm the current vice chair. And I've had almost 20 years working on the spectrum, and I've had over 40 years living as an adult. Well, as a person on the spectrum, I wasn't an adult for quite all of that, at least on the outside. But even with all those qualifications, if you look back over our keynotes that we've had here at the conference the last 8-9 years, I'm a little bit of a step down. Okay, I don't have quite all the letters after my name that some of these people do. You're not going to hear Jared Stewart, world best-selling author, at least not yet. But I'll do my best, and I hope that each of you leave here with two things today. Number one, some perspective into autism, a window into the mind and heart of somebody that you work with autism, a new way to look at it. And number two, some tips and tools that will hopefully be somewhat new to you as you go through it. And in the process, I wish myself luck. I've had a lot of people wish me luck today. On my monitor, if you ever see my computer monitor, there's a little sticky note that says, I wish myself luck. And I totally stole it from this guy. Who knows who Donald Triplett is? Okay, you should know Donald Triplett. He was the very first case of autism. Okay, back in the 1930s, Donald Triplett was found by Dr. Connor. Donald was a strange child. In fact, he had what we would now call classic autism, because classic autism is based on Donald and Donald's behaviors. And he spun himself, and he did weird things with his fingers, and he didn't pay attention to adults, and he struggled with verbal skills, and he gave people numbers instead of names, and didn't seem to care about his parents, and didn't give eye contact, and didn't like touch. And Donald was put into an insane asylum at the age of 3 in 1936. Let me just pause and say a couple things about preconceptions. When you look at someone like Donald, and all his doctors and parents were like, this kid, he's hopelessly insane. There's nothing that he's going to be able to do. And I continue to talk to adults to this day who their parents were told, oh, they'll never talk. Oh, they'll never be able to do blank. People on the spectrum who were told, oh, you're going to better do this, or you're going to end up flipping burgers, you're going to end up homeless, you're going to end up in prison. I think of Alexis Weinman, who was the Autistic Miss America contestant. And she wanted to be a scientist, and she was so excited, and she told her teacher, and her teacher said, oh, hon, They don't let retards into space. There's just too much of that. And Donald's a great example of why we don't lock into preconceptions. This is Donald today. He is in his 80s. He still lives in the same little town in Missouri. And guess what? He graduated high school. In fact, he graduated college and was an active frat member. In fact, he's a retired bank teller. And he lives on his own in his 80s, which is more than some neurotypicals can say. And he figured out how to use a cell phone, and he texts everybody in town. And he golfs and he drives, and he learned all these things. Again, notice he learned things at a delayed rate. He got his driver's license when he was 27, and he's kind of still crazy as a driver. Fairly rigid routine, awkward golf stroke. He's by himself a lot. When he travels the world, he just goes by himself, takes pictures, comes home, scrapbooks it, maybe shares it with somebody. But the town people love him. They accept Donald for his differences. When the Atlantic went to do their article, they said, well, what do you know about Donald? And everybody in town was like, well, you're not going to make him look stupid, are you? Donald ain't stupid, he's smart. And he's awesome. And the more you learn about him, the better. I bumped into Karen Zucker, who wrote Life in a Different Key in Manhattan last year. And I was talking to her about Donald Triplett, because I had nothing else to talk to her about. And she said they're doing a documentary on him for PBS, so look forward to that. Donald got taken out of the asylum and put on a farm. And that was his early childhood interventions. And being in a small town, which was also my early childhood interventions. When you're in a small town, people can be like, okay, yeah, Jared's weird, but there's no one else to play with. So that works. And I'm from Alaska, and everybody's weird in Alaska. So that helps. But Donald, in his yearbook, he was writing in everybody's yearbook, and he wrote, I wish you luck, I wish you luck. And when they found Donald's yearbook, he'd written, I wish myself luck on his picture. And that's where that comes from. So I wish myself luck, along with Donald, because he's a great example of what I want to talk about. So why do I need luck? Well, okay, this is tough. It's tough being up here, right? And for those of us on the autism spectrum, you laugh, but would you want to be up here in my shoes, with like thousands of eyeballs at you and the lights streaming down and everything? In fact, if we could get at least the audience lights down a little bit, that would be cool. But imagine if you had to get up here in front of hundreds of people and talk to them, and you're talking to them, and they're professionals, and they've spent their lives working in these areas and working with these people. And then imagine if you had to do that in a foreign language. Because really, socializing is a foreign language, and some of us with autism are more fluent in it, but it's still like talking in a foreign language. The person who really broke that barrier for us was Temple Grandin, almost exactly 30 years ago. It was May 1989, she was in North Carolina. It was the first time she gave a conference presentation. And she stood up and said, I'm an autistic adult, and I have a career, and I have a PhD. And it blew people's minds because they had no idea that people with autism had an inner lived experience at all. She opened the door for all of us. But it's a tough thing to talk about. Again, it's a really broad topic. It's a really broad spectrum. And every lived experience is going to be totally unique. Let me tell you a little bit about my lived experience. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I do whole presentations on this and pretty much everything else in there. This is me as a kid. You can see, probably not, but this is my wet blanket I had to have in my mouth because I needed that oral stim and I wouldn't take a bottle or a pacifier. But I needed that to fall asleep. You see my Ernie doll there. I was super hyperfixated on Sesame Street until the age of 3. So, sorry. But I was totally geeking out with Frank Campagna when he came, he's a Sesame Street producer. He's like, yeah, we're going to make an autistic Muppet. I'm like, you already have an autistic Muppet. Bert is totally autistic. But as a child, I talked in Sesame Street voices. I touched the world with my little pinky here. My parents called it my elephant finger because tactile sensation's a lot less when you just use one pinky. Obviously, tremendously good eye contact. Hated getting haircuts because I didn't like my ears being touched, didn't like showering for the same reason. Elementary school started that realization that I was different. And things were a lot harder. I got bullied pretty heavily. I did learn to stop talking in Sesame Street voices, although my kids have liked it when I've read to them in Sesame Street voices with books. I was 10 years old here. I grew up really poor, and being either really rich or really poor is a pretty good intervention for autism. But being poor, you don't have a lot of choices. You have got to work. But we were living at my grandmother's house that Christmas because we were kind of homeless. She wanted to make it special, and she bought me this amazingly awesome Cobra Night Raven based on the SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest spy jet in the history of the world. And obviously, greatest Christmas of my life, and nobody told my face. And every year thereafter, my grandmother gave me cash instead of a present. Junior high was when the proverbial stuff hit the fan. All of a sudden I went from one teacher to a whole bunch of teachers. They all had different rooms, different rules. There was a locker room, there was hormones, there was teenagers, there was people who noticed that I was wearing the same clothes every day. Although I did stop wearing my Spider-Man suit under my clothes, because by junior high I had figured that out. But it was just getting to be too much. And those of you who know my story, 7th grade year, partway through, I just burned out. That was it, I was done. I told my parents after Christmas vacation I'm not going back to school. And they begged and bribed and pleaded and threatened, and as some of you who work with autism may know, we can be a little bit stubborn when we want to be. And so they called the school district, said, well, he can't go back to school. They're like, well, he can't drop out, he's 12. This is Alaska, but we're civilized here still. And so they let me do correspondence classes, and my parents were worried about it. They were like, hey, you can do correspondence classes. I'm like, what's that? Well, they'll send you to work by mail. I was like, where's this been for my entire school career, right? But I isolated to my room, and I drew and read. I did my correspondence stuff in like 2 hours, and I had the rest of the day to kind of focus on what I wanted to focus on. I got really into The Price is Right on our one channel. But really, this could have been the end of my story. I know so many adults who have this be the end of their story. They graduate to the couch where they're kind of stuck because they've burned out so bad and they have PTSD from school and whatever else. I do, again, like I said, a whole presentation on this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But through a series of events, I realized I had to go back to school. And though no one in my family had ever graduated college, I knew I needed to go to college. And luckily, I was able to come up with some systems and some supports that helped me through that, even though I didn't have an autism diagnosis, because Asperger's wasn't even in the DSM until I was graduated from high school, because I'm really old. But I ended up graduating top of my class, again, from a small little school in Alaska. But I ended up with a full scholarship. I've been married 21 years in just a couple weeks here. My wife's right here today. Program director at Scenic View, but presented all over the country, adjunct professor. I say this because we too often don't get to brag, don't get to talk about the good things that do happen. And to say that, you know what, regardless of functioning, whether you're Donald or you're me or whoever you are, our stories turn out unexpectedly good more often than not. And the research is starting to finally show that. So why would I need luck? Well, this is a tough task. And I probably made this slide out of a defense mechanism of worrying about what you guys would think of me. Sometimes I get in front of audiences and I'm like, oh, if I only had PhD behind my name, then they'd listen to me. Or I'm considering going back for a BCBA, maybe then they'll listen to me. I hope you guys are listening to me. I hope you're listening open-heartedly. Because it's very easy to discredit the person and say, oh, well, you know, they can't really be autistic, or they can't really have any relevance because they're so exceptional, or, well, they may have some good things to say, but we don't have to take them seriously. I mean, they are autistic after all. It's easy to start getting caught in those stories, and my bottom line here is just whatever story you're telling yourself about people with autism, watch that story, watch your motives. Because if you're not telling the right story, you're liable to do more harm than good. Yeah, I'm up here because I'm disabled. I'm up here because I have the label of autism. And I hope that you can see past that and see me for a person. But if all you can even see me as is autism, I'll take it, because every person I've ever met with autism, and I have worked with literally hundreds of people with autism in my career so far, they all need people in their lives who understand, sympathize with, and are willing to help them through their lived experience. Autism's getting better in how it's portrayed, but it's still got a lot of negativity about it. It's still got a lot of bad stuff, right? This is just 12 years ago when the New York University ran their ransom notes campaign. We have your son. We will make sure he will not be able to care for himself or interact socially as long as he lives. And this is only the beginning. Right? If you're the person with autism and you see this, you're like, wait, what? Just 10 years ago, this was Autism Speaks, who's supposed to be like the premier organization for helping people with autism. And this was an actual commercial they ran, and I hope sound is working.
I am autism. I'm visible in your children, but if I can help it, I am invisible to you until it's too late. I know where you live, and guess what? I live there too. I hover around all of you. I know no color barrier, no religion, no morality, no currency. I speak your language fluently, and with every voice I take away, I acquire yet another language. I work very quickly. I work faster than pediatric AIDS, cancer, and diabetes combined. And if you are happily married, I will make sure that your marriage fails. Your money will fall into my hands.
Folks, this is called fear-mongering, okay? And I'm going to quit this commercial because it gives me chills, and being narrated by Satan and having the wind in the background doesn't help. I'm autism. I will deflate your tires. I will lose your socks in the dryer. It's terrible stuff. And even when they started going into Autism Awareness Day, again, just in the last decade, they used words like combating autism, it's a destroyer, and they stuck up all these empty strollers in Central Park to represent the ravages of this horrible epidemic and disease. And again, things are getting a little better, but folks, this is just in the last decade. And for those of us with autism, a lot of times it seems like Autism Awareness Month might be awareness we don't really want. Okay, and that's one of those stale memes that we get to see over and over, because Lord of the Rings is one of my special interests, and so if I can have Boromir help me, it's great. But again, Boromir's right here. We don't just need a day for awareness. We need more than awareness, and we need more than a day. So you'll see that hashtag Autism Acceptance Month. But you'll also see people saying, look, as long as we're looking at autism as a kidnapper, a killer, a barrier, an army that's against us, we're not going to get to acceptance, and yet acceptance is where we need to be. Okay, awareness is saying, okay, this is something that exists, right? Acceptance is saying, oh, that thing that exists is valid and, it's adequate, right? If you're a BYU fan, and I'm going to make a sports analogy here, so I'm going to screw it up, but if you're a BYU fan, you are aware that University of Utah fans exist, right? Okay, there's awareness. Is there acceptance, right? Awareness should lead to acceptance. Acceptance should lead to advocacy. And if you're the person with autism, your self-awareness should lead to self-acceptance, should lead to self-advocacy, which will help you to be more self-determining, more self-reliant, which will help you discipline yourself, and eventually lead to high-quality life outcomes, right? But we've got a long way to go to get to acceptance. We have gotten a little beyond Rain Man, although I recommend for those of you who've actually old enough as me to see this, go back and watch this guy here, because he plays the brother, and he's got a lot of autistic characteristics as well. But if you look today, we live in a day and age where there are media presentations of autism all over the place, and hopefully you've seen some of these shows. But the great thing about this is now our stereotype has gone to brilliant but quirky. And it's like, okay, well, that's a lot better than some stereotypes. But it's still not totally fair because we're not all totally brilliant, and sometimes our quirkiness isn't super useful. So today I want to explain some things to you that, from an autistic perspective, that will hopefully help you. All right, so here's the 5 things I want you to walk away with. 1, some terms. 2, some perspective. 3, some rules of thumb. 4, some tips. And finally, some hope. And we're going to go through each of these 5 if time will permit. And if not, again, download the PowerPoint and read it on your own. Here's some terms. We're going to talk about autism spectrum disorder, all those neuro words you hear about, the difference between doubly discriminated and doubly disabled and high functioning and low functioning. These terms are critically important if you're going to have the right conversations about autism. Autism, again, it's a spectrum, right? It's also kind of an umbrella. They put a lot of things under it, although I guess they've taken Rett syndrome out of there. So a lot of things there. And along with Sheldon, my Asperger's was cured in 2013, miraculously, when they dropped it from the DSM. But you know the criteria, right? We have the deficits in social communication and interaction, the restricted repetitive patterns of behavior and interest. We have the sensory issues. I love that they added this one. Symptoms must be present in early childhood, but may not become fully manifest until demands exceed skills, because that's really how I see mine. But it's from the inside, as we look at our autism, it's like, okay, so I'm kind of bad at talking to people and looking like people and helping people understand me and relationships, partly because we have some strange ways of using words or our bodies or objects, and we struggle with rigidity and wanting things a certain way, and we have hyper-focused interests and hyperactive senses that can overwhelm us. But we also have a lot of strengths, which I will go into too. But that combination of challenges is different in each person. And so if you look at the autism spectrum, it's really, really broad. And a lot of people like to think of the spectrum as being like low functioning on one end and high functioning on the other, and that's not at all how people on the spectrum see the spectrum. We see it more like a color spectrum, where you're like, okay, there's all these different shades and all these different hues of colors, but you don't say like, well, that's a high functioning puce, and that's a low functioning pink, and it doesn't even make sense to call it that. It also means that because of that, the spectrum's gonna have some really weird exceptions on it, some outliers who may be so extreme that you're like, wait, they've got autism? Consider for a second if Jerry Seinfeld might be on the spectrum.
And that's the thing about Jerry Seinfeld. At age 60, he's still figuring out who he is. For example, in recent years, as he's learned more about autism spectrum disorders, he sees it in himself.
I think on a very drawn-out scale, I think I'm on the spectrum.
Why? What are the markers if I were sitting here analyzing you?
You're never paying attention to the right things. Basic social engagement is really a struggle. I'm very literal. When people talk to me and they use expressions, sometimes I don't know what they're saying. But I don't see it as dysfunctional. I just think of it as an alternate mindset.
And of course, Jerry's going to think of it as an alternate mindset, right? I mean, the guy is worth over $900 million, so he's been a little bit successful. And in fact, he got successful doing an entire show about noticing the little minutiae and details that no one else paid attention to. A show about nothing, and it starred characters who literally have the worst social skills of any characters on television ever. And so, maybe it's a broad spectrum, but again, a better way to look at it might be with the spectrum graphs that the GAO came out with. I was excited when they did. Where you find someone like Jerry Seinfeld who might have intense focus and some social issues, but they're not really struggling so much in the other areas. But then you might find someone over here who's pretty much nonverbal, but maybe not struggling with some of the other areas. Every one of us is going to have a different individual spectrum graph, and that means that no two people are going to look the same with autism. And it also means you can't tell who has autism just by looking at them. I talk to my students all the time. One of the worst things that we get told is, well, you don't look autistic. And I was talking to this, and one of my students raised her hand, and she's like, whenever anyone asks me, hey, you don't look autistic, or they make that comment, I always say, you don't look stupid, and yet here we are. So a bottom line being, if you've seen one person with autism, you've seen one person with autism. And why are we different? Well, because our brains are different. You've heard the term neurotypical, I hope, meaning people whose brain wiring is kind of the norm. Therefore, those of us whose brain wiring is different than the norm, we are neurodiverse. And the good thing is that diversity is a valuable good thing. And so this is a cool way to start looking at autism spectrum, but also ADHD, LD, the neurodiversity community. Now, those whose brains are typical, they're in the neuromajority. Those of us who aren't are in the neurominority. And because we're in the minority status, what that means is we're kind of at the mercy of the majority to say, oh, you're different than us, and therefore you're disordered, and you're wrong, okay? But imagine for a second if the shoe is on the other foot. And a big thank you to my scenic few friends here to help me put this together this week.
I read social significance into absolutely everything.
I demand that others engage in uninteresting, unimportant small talk.
My eye contact is so good, it's unsettling.
If any of these symptoms sound familiar, you or a loved one may be struggling with NTS, neurotypical syndrome. Neurotypical syndrome affects roughly 58 out of 59 children worldwide. Neurotypical syndrome is incurable, pervasive, and may be apparent in infants as young as 3 months old. Additional symptoms include failing to recognize when sensory stimuli are too high or too low, engaging in excessive touch, eye contact, smell, and sound levels, and expecting non-neurotypicals to do the same. May adhere to apparently inflexible, non-functional routines or rituals, such as wearing a tie, high heels, or other uncomfortable clothing.
I heard straight from the horse's mouth that you should let sleeping dogs lie, but instead, I end up putting my foot in my mouth by using idioms that literally make no sense.
If you know someone with NTS, don't give up. There is hope. Despite their challenges, with early intervention, many NTs have learned to compensate for their disabilities and to interact normally with an autistic person or specialized interest.
I have NTS.
I have NTS.
I have NTS.
And I'm okay.
And I'm okay.
And I'm not playing with a full deck.
This has been a public service announcement brought to you by the Institute for the Study of the Neurologically Typical.
Thank you, Stewart. So again, imagine if you got up every morning and a big chunk of your identity was defined in these kind of terms. And this is the full criteria I created. There's a bunch of versions of it. You can read through it on your own. But remember to check your neurotypical privilege. Being in a majority means it's really easy to discriminate against that minority. So all of us with autism kind of get discriminated against, but some get doubly discriminated. That's the next term. So if you're a racial minority, guess what? You're way less likely to actually get the diagnosis. Autism itself has no genetic preference for any race. And yet, all that gray there are states where you're underdiagnosed in a certain racial group. Another doubly discriminated. If you're on both the autism spectrum and the LGBT rainbow, then you're likely to have both communities with people who reject you and feel doubly excluded. I was in Washington, D.C. and talked to these people with a booth from New York who are working to change that, but it's still a lot of discrimination. Gender is the same thing. These are some of my heroes. You see Sarah here. But with women on the spectrum, they face all kinds of extra discrimination, partly because, and I'm not going to go through all this, but they're often able to pass an ADOS with flying colors because they've taken some of their autistic focus and put it on social skills. And they've learned camouflage. But because of that, they tend to have higher anxiety, to be more vulnerable for exploitation, go to behavior extremes. They have higher rates of LGBT and suicidal thoughts, and I'm not saying LGBT is negative here, I'm just saying the stats. And up to 20 times more likely to have an eating disorder. That's something that really needs to be dealt with more and more. There's probably no way that it should be 5-to-1 males to females. If you talk to anybody on the spectrum, it seems like it at most should be like 2-to-1. Now, if we have time, I would show you a little of this lady's story. We don't, but Daryl Hannah, look it up. She came out a few years ago as autistic, and her life story has been one of being so socially awkward and anxious that she couldn't go do the press for all her movies and stuff. And she's just now at 58 gotten married. She married Neil Young. How cool is that? But women on the spectrum need a lot more help than they're currently getting. So on top of the doubly discriminated, there's a lot of double disability. Autism tends to not come alone, right? So we have much higher rates of ADHD, of allergies, eating disorders, GI disorders, learning disabilities, mood disorders like depression or anger, motor problems, severe anxiety disorders, sleep disorders, suicide, Tourette's syndrome. And the cool thing is, if you look at your conference program, there's a lot of sessions being done today that are addressing some of these comorbid conditions, and they're really critically important and easily overlooked because of diagnostic overshadowing, where the autism kind of says, oh, okay, well, you don't need to treat this, it's all the autism. No, treat this, and you'll often find the autism's not so big a deal. Another one, low functioning versus high functioning, and I don't spend a lot of time on this, even though it's one of my pet peeves. I mean, really, what are we saying? Who gets to define what's high and low functioning compared to what? And on any given day, I can be high or low functioning. If I'm teaching a class, I'm fairly high functioning. If I'm driving, my wife's laughing over here, I'm very low functioning. And I'm lucky to be driving at all. I'm lucky my wife likes to drive. And those of us that have supposedly high functioning autism, mild autism, if my autism is mild, it's because you perceive it as mild. And I've worked really hard for you to perceive it as mild. It's not because I experience it as mild at all. So that's it for the terms. Let's talk about some perspective. And the first one connects to that. We worry way too much about normal. And we need to remember that autistic people are people who are unique in some ways, same in other ways, and autism is not a tragedy. Autism is about saying, wait a minute, I am normal. I don't need to be some broken version of your normal, I'm me. What is normal, said one of my former students. Honestly, if you had someone that measured up to normal in every single category, they're exactly average height, weight, whatever, they'd be really abnormal. Okay, that doesn't happen. Trying to be normal creates a lot for those of us on the spectrum. The more normal I tried to be, the less normal I secretly felt, and the more of a failure. Jerry Newport, there's nothing more frustrating than the lifetime of scars accumulated from trying to be like normal people and failing daily. Normal is not the objective. Could you imagine if the greatest compliment you ever received in your life is like, wow, you're so normal? It's like, really? That's what you're striving for? Now, there are times you may want normal, right? I mean, who's seen Autism in Love? If you haven't seen that, it's a great documentary. It's free on Netflix. This is Dave and Lindy. They get married. It's awesome. And marriage is one of those things that quote-unquote normal people do. But for those of us on the spectrum, we're going to do it uniquely, even if we do quote-unquote normal things. And you should consider, again, does this person want some education? They want to drive, be independent, have a career, date, have kids. Not everyone should. Not everyone does. All you neurotypicals in here, raise your hand if you have at least one of these normal things that you are not doing currently or haven't done. Okay? Oh my goodness. You're abnormal. And yet, people with autism, we often see our peers doing these things and we assume this is what everybody does. So instead of normalization, let's strive for maximization. Right? Normalization says, your autism's wrong, and we should get you to look exactly like neurotypicals and act exactly like neurotypicals. Maximization says, hey, you're autistic, that's great. Let's see how far we can get you to go. Let's see where your story ends up. Maximization seeks to actualize potential as an autistic person and says, how can they become their best self and achieve their best future? Where normalization says, how can we make them the same as everybody else? Get away from normalization. Part of that is remembering that we're people. Okay? We have our own personalities, our own rights, our own inner world and outer world. Some people get hung up on person with autism versus autistic person, and I totally understand that, right? Because autism is not an accessory, right? It's something that we do all the time. And so I'll generally refer to myself as an autistic person, but if you don't, it doesn't offend me. I'd rather that you just thought of me as a person, because people are people. We have the same set of dreams. We want to be valued. We want to be competent. We want to be autonomous. We want to be connected. We might do it uniquely, but we do. Let's talk about some of the things that make us unique from an autistic perspective. Specialty slots, hyperfocus, the crash, meltdowns, novel brain. Specialty slots. Good, we got some Jeopardy fans in the crowd. If this had been the show I got interested in, I would never have stopped. Eventually, though, you learn the retail value of everything in California, and you don't care about Price is Right anymore. Like I said earlier, a lot of girls with autism, they'll pick this category for some reason. And they'll actually get good at the social skills and the camouflage. But if you look at these other categories, yeah, they're stereotypical and they're funny. But why is it that autistic people end up with these same specialized categories all the time? It's because that's what they were exposed to. If all they've been exposed to is fantasy and video games and anime, that's what they're going to hyper-focus on. That's what they're going to specialize in. And hyper-focus is a superpower, right? It's awesome. We can focus forever on stuff. And we perseverate, right? This was totally me as a kid. My mom would get so mad because I've been calling and calling and calling you, and I'm reading Lord of the Rings for the 10th time or whatever. And I couldn't hear her. I remember one time I was reading, and I was so into the book, I started snacking while I was reading, and I ate an entire case of Hostess Twinkies. Like the entire case. There was probably like 48 Twinkies in this. And I only noticed when I literally threw up, and I was like, oh my gosh, I ate all those. I've never had Twinkies since. Never. Plenty of other food. So we can go for hours, and we get it's so frustrating when you finally find a neurotypical who wants to talk about something like Lord of the Rings, and they give up after like 20 minutes. So lame. Another thing that is not a superpower is the autism crash, and it's something that is unique in the sense that when we crash, we can't just crash a little, we crash a lot. Right? Everybody crashes, but we crash harder. The crash is basically when we're building up a lot of momentum and we're going on in life and we're doing stuff and we accidentally or unaware or sometimes willfully blind take on more than we can handle. And what happens is that we start really stressing out, and our sensory issues and our social skills and our need for routine and sameness starts freaking us out. We get really, really anxious. And this is where Dr. Stephen Shore talks about the APES, the autistic preemptive strike, where we're like, oh crud, this is going bad, so I'll drop that class or I'll quit that job or whatever else because then I can't fail. And then that's one way to deal with it. It's not the best. We should learn to be able to cope with it, but if we don't, withdraw. We know we're going to go to stage 3, where we actually now, we're so overwhelmed, we stop going to class, we stop going to work, we start having meltdowns, we start shutting down, and now, boom, we crash. We drop out of school, we get fired from that job, we ruin that relationship, whatever it happens to be. And again, everybody crashes like this, but we crash harder. We have to do all that cleanup and repair, and there's a lot of psychological scarring and damage. But it's worse for us because of what Temple Grandin calls the 3 Ps. That this is pervasive, personal, and permanent. That not only did we fail in this one area, we failed in every area. And not only did we fail, but we personally are a failure. And not only are we a failure in this one area, for this one time, we're a failure forever. So I'm never going to try to go to school again, or I'm never going to work again. It just didn't work out. And that all or nothing thinking kicks in. And then we have the choice to give up forever on that area, or restart the crash cycle, or we have the choice to learn some skills, some systems, some adjustment, and be able to get out of it. Because that's what we want to do. You want to create a crash helmet for the person you're working with, where they can crash, but they can pull themselves out of the ditch much faster. I still crash, but I tend to crash more shallowly now. And if I had time, I could tell you about some of the huge crashes I've had. But we can get out of it. We can get to the other side. It's going to take no shame, no blame, no excuses, though, where you don't make the person feel bad about it. And it's not about whose fault it is. It's okay. What are we going to do? How are we going to move forward in spite of this? And realizing that there's life beyond the crash. Another thing that there needs to be no shame with, meltdowns. All right. Meltdowns are a natural human response. I mean, how many of you in here have ever been like, I'm going to lose it? Okay, well, guess what? That just happens more frequently to those of us with autism. Okay, but it's the same thing. And when you're melting down, you really can't deal with whatever it happens to be. As we get older, we are so embarrassed by our reaction during a meltdown, we tend to shut down instead. We burn out, we stop talking, we withdraw. The last time I had a full-on meltdown, we were at Sand Dune Arch in Arches National Park. My wife's laughing already. With the kids. I'm wearing sunscreen, which is already just the most awful thing, but it's better than sunburn. And all of a sudden, the kids are kicking things, and there's sand stuck in my arms, and there's sand down my shirt, and there's sand everywhere, and it's hot, and I'm just sitting here. And finally, I'm like, honey, I think we need to go. And she's like, no, it's great. The kids are having a great time. Let's stay. No, I really think we need to leave. And finally, she's like, noticed that I'm about to die. And she's like, yeah, honey, the kids, let's go. Daddy needs to. I just bolted back to the car, and I took all our water, and I'm dumping it all over myself. She's like, that's our only water. What are you doing? And I just had to get that off. So it still happens. But don't punish and shame. Help with self-awareness. Help us figure out what's going on. Think of people like plants is a great way to look at meltdowns, okay? If a plant is not responding the way you want, you don't shout at it, you don't shame it, you don't create a behavior plan for it necessarily, right? You change the environment, change the water, change the soil. That's a good way to deal with meltdowns. Now this is a more positive one. Some days it's a negative one. Novel brain. What it means is because our brains as autistic people are so focused on details, tiny little differences means, I've never seen this before, I'm sorry. So when I'm driving, my brain is like, different weather, different song on the radio, we're going to a different destination, there's other cars on the road. I'm sorry, I've never done this before, you're on your own now. And so every time I drive, I feel like I'm taking my driver's test again. It's just that level of nervousness. If you're a person with a neurotypical brain, these are all apples. But if you're an autistic person, you have a different file for Granny Smith and for Red Delicious, which are red but not delicious. Okay? But someday the day comes when you realize, oh my gosh, these are all the same thing, and these files merge. But the autistic brain is actually this one on the right. We store things all over the place, and it takes forever to get to this neurotypical connectivity. Now those are unique things. Here's some same things. We have the same needs for empathy, communication, and flexibility, and it needs to be a two-way street. Because supposedly, we're the autistics, we're the ones that lack empathy, we're the ones that need flexibility, and yet we're trying to learn your language, and we appreciate a little reciprocity from time to time. It's ironic that autistic people are expected to have troubles with insight into others when so many neurotypical people have trouble with insight into autistics. And part of that is because of this circular reasoning. Oh, if there's a problem, it must be the autistic person, right? So if an autistic person can't understand the neurotypical, it's because autistics don't have the empathy and the skills. But if a neurotypical can't understand the autistic person, it's because the autistic person doesn't have the empathy or the skills. So we need to make this a two-way street. One of my former students, she talks about how just exhausting it is always worrying that you're giving people the wrong impression because you're sharing details that you don't realize what they're thinking and you're doing the wrong nonverbals. And I stole this from Brene Brown, but empathy is always assuming that the person you're working with is legitimately giving it their very best. Okay? Always assume that the person you're working with is giving it their best. Now, if you do want to talk to us, here's some tips. Respect our accommodations, okay? If I need to draw during a meeting, or if someone's got to wear headphones or use a speech device, respect it. Consider timing from our point of view. If you're my wife, are you trying to talk to me when I'm right in the middle of one of my interest objects? That's not going to work. Consider setting from our point of view, what's going on sensorily, and help with the overload. Don't require eye contact. A lot of us with autism, it's like I can either make eye contact or I can listen to you. I can't do both, right? And if we're silent, don't take that personally. That will never happen with me, but with others. Don't freak out about our nonverbals, even if we're wearing weird clothes or whatever, or haven't trimmed our nails in a million years. Try to sincerely connect to our interests and strengths, allow space to process and comment. Get in our world, and then ask us one question at a time, and let us answer. Give us the time to do that, and don't make multiple requests or switch topics before we get to the end. And please, whatever you do, no surprises. My wife has learned this the hard way over and over. And she finally gave up, and I said, oh, you finally learned. She's like, no, you're no fun to surprise at all. You just don't give the right reactions. And I don't have time to go through this, but there was this great blog written about ways you can accidentally damage this autistic child without even realizing it, because you're talking about them like they're not there, or assuming that everything is their autism instead of seeing them as a unique person, or believing that they're less reliable. And I like this one. Instead of saying, oh, I love the child, but I hate the autism, just love the child. The child is their autism. You wouldn't say, well, I love my son, but I hate his maleness. Okay? Don't do that. And autism, again, it's not a tragedy. I like what Jim Sinclair says to parents. You didn't lose a child to autism. You lost a child because the child you waited for never came into existence. And that's not the fault of the autistic child you do have. We need and deserve families who can see us and value us for ourselves, not families whose vision of us is obscured by ghosts of children who never lived. Grieve if you must for your own lost dreams, but don't mourn for us. And yeah, if you're that parent, you may need to go through the stages of grief, but don't take it out on that child. You got a child who's there, that needs you, that loves you, that wants to connect with you, and you may need to find a way to do that. So if autism is not a tragedy, what is it? Here's some good rules of thumb. Autism is a developmental disorder, a disorder of extremes, a disorder of overwhelm, a disorder of relationships, and a disorder of emotion. Developmental disorder. What I like to talk about in two groups is the rule of 2/3, which says that those of us with autism are roughly 2/3 socially, emotionally of our chronological age. So that means when you're 18 with autism, you're 12. Okay? But it also means when you're 30 with autism, you're 20. And so when we work at Scenic View with those adults in that kind of 18 to 30 range, we see some amazing growth because developmentally that's where they're at. The other cool thing, when I turned 44 last week, I'm 29.05, baby. That's right. And Donald's really kicking it. There's actually a weird Harvard study that they did where they found they could not find one instance of a diagnosed adult who had both autism and Alzheimer's. And it may be because the brain stays plastic and longer. So, possible cool superpower. It's a developmental delay, and I don't have time to go through all the research, but what they're saying is even if you have intellectual disabilities with your autism, it's getting better, and it gets better over time. Because guess what? All humans are developmentally delayed, right? Compared to any other animal on planet Earth, you're developmentally delayed. It takes us forever to become adults. Why? So our brains can develop better. Well, with autism, it just takes even longer. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Another thing they find as we get older and get out of the school system, our autism gets better. Another thing they find is that our social stuff is better as adults, and we may even get married. Second rule of thumb, it's a disorder of extremes. Any characteristic you can think of, autism is going to be out there on the extremes. A little overlap with normal, but we're going to be different, right? So we're going to be the emotional extremes, right? We either kind of flat or really elevated. If you're autistic, you can't just be a little sad or a little angry, right? It just doesn't happen. Sensitivities, we tend to be over or under sensitive to the same things. Higher or lower creativity, we tend to have no care about something or else be really fanatical. We tend to talk a lot or not talk much at all. We see time as now or not now. Hygiene, usually messy or immaculate. Body tone, tight, loose. We tend to be either very rational, hyper-rational, or hypo-rational. my son with autism, if you say, and you'll feel it in your heart, he says, well, actually, the heart is an organ that pumps blood and oxygen throughout the body and carries nutrients. And it doesn't even look like that shape, right? But this is the same son that if you ask him, like, okay, we need to get rid of some of your toys here, you have way too many toys, he's like, but it'll hurt their feelings. So, again, almost any extreme you can think of, right? So that's that hyper or hypo-rationality. We tend to be obsession or apathy. And what that means is for those of us with autism, it's really hard. If we're going to care about something, we're going to really care about it. If we're going to like something, we're going to really like it. And as a result, if we can't muster that energy, we're going to be apathetic. And so a lot of the times, autism comes across as apathy because we just don't have that energy. Another extreme, again, the hyperverbal. This is my side. And if you've been with an autistic person who's talking about something they want to talk about, you've seen them try to download that file, right? And they'll just keep following you because they want to download that whole file before they leave. But you'll also see other people with autism, like my sister, who are really quiet. And she always thought it was weird that I just could not shut up. And you can tell she trusts you when she's quiet with you. Other thing, it's a disorder of overwhelm. This is my new friend, Danny Rady. We were down in San Antonio together, and we were talking about the autism sensory funnel. And he talks about why we're so overwhelmed emotionally and sensorily. You guys keep trying to teach us executive functioning and social skills, and we can't even get to awareness because we're still trying to deal with the overwhelm down here. And he talks about the vagus nerve and how we need to work on vagal tone. And I was talking to him about vagal conditioning, and it was cool. This is the resiliency we need to get. Because the world is really overwhelming for people with autism, but we could make all of you autistic if we tried. It wouldn't be that hard. Another part of the overwhelm means that we're going to get worn out quickly. Okay, our battery supply is lower, especially when we're around other people. I'm on right now, and it's going to be great, and I'm going to be on all day, and as soon as this conference is over, I'm going to go home and crash. I don't know if I'll even make the networking dinner. I hope I can. But it's just tough. Day-to-day life can be absolutely exhausting for us. Another part of the overwhelm is that super attention to detail. If you have ADHD, you see the whole forest and run right into a tree. If you have autism, you see that tree and the little ant crawling on that piece of bark, on that leaf, and you may never know, but there was a forest, there was a tree. Okay? Autism is noticing the needle before the haystack. Autism is hearing better when you wear glasses with tinted lenses because part of the overwhelm is all of our senses are affecting the other senses. When we first got married, I'd walk in from the hot outdoors into the cold apartment, and my wife, we were first married, she'd run up to give me a big hug because she's a hugger, and I'd push her away, which is not the nonverbal you want to send to your new wife. But we had to work through what that was, and it's physically painful for me to go from one temperature extreme to another. It's overwhelming. Sleep is another one that's overwhelming, and there's some stuff today. Autism is having to sleep with a brain that won't shut off, a fan on, music on, ridiculously rigid routines, or just random. 1,000 comfort items, or an empty room, a dose of melatonin, or a prescription med, or weighted blankets, or a warm bath, or a dog. No one knows. No one has that answer. All right. Autism is also a disorder of intimacy, right? The relationship issues. I was on a panel with Karen Fairchild's daughter, and they asked us, what's the best and worst thing about having autism? And we both said at the same time, other people. And it is. Permanent sense of feeling misunderstood is something my students have told me. Or I feel like I'm an imposter all the time. Or I'm dealing with pathological loneliness. All of us with autism, we need connection. And we also need connection with other people with autism, so we realize that, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one like this. So put in a little plug here for our OtCon coming up here in a couple weeks. Autism's getting a call from your mom and not answering because it's like, whoa, I don't have time to think of what I'm going to tell her. This is very much how it goes. Our social processing delays. It's like there's a foreign language everyone else speaks. This one, when we're trying to socialize, all of our sensitivities get in the way, right? I was talking with one of our students, and she's like, I want to start dating. And I'm like, well, let's start dating. And she's like, well, I kind of want to hold this guy's hand, but whenever anything touches my palm, it's just really painful. And it's like, oh, that's true. It's tough. We also have problems with groups and teams because they accentuate all of our problems with socializing and with sensory stuff, right? Autism is calling in sick because there's a staff retreat, right? There will be lots of team building activities. Oh, no. the social stuff also, when we're socializing, our autistic strengths become our weaknesses, right? So suddenly the fact that I have this big vocabulary and all this knowledge just makes me a nerd, and now I'm not doing great anymore. Autism is seeing someone outside their normal context and not saying hi because you aren't sure if it's even them, or because you definitely can't remember their name, right? My son with autism, when my wife would even just put her hair in a ponytail as a baby, he would reach up and try and knock the ponytail out. Because, what happened to mom? What is she doing? Right? And for all of you hint-dropping neurotypicals out there, please stop, right? My wife, when we first get married, she'd say things like, "Are you hungry?" And I'd be like, "Why no, but thanks for asking. How thoughtful, right?" You all know what this means, but I had no idea. She was saying, "I need to go get some food right now." Are you cold? Meant shut the window, right? It's a foreign language. I love this. This was one of my students. Autism's everyone laughing at you when you ask what a Johnny Depp is. We miss out on common knowledge. For me, movies are not mine. I obsess about movies, so I know all that stuff. Johnny Depp is actually literally my sixth cousin. But sports is my thing. If you talk to me about sports, I have none of that common knowledge, so sorry. One last word there about relationships. It's okay to be introverted. And sometimes with autism, you can have a relationship with your stuffed animals, or with your collection, or with turning on a radio or a podcast you like, and that will fill up your social batteries. So that's okay too for some people on that extreme end. Temple Grandin's got way more friends than she needs. And she says we worry too much about it. Some of the best days, like Alice Rose said, are the ones where nobody's expecting you to socialize at all. Okay, last rule of thumb, autism spectrum disorder, ASD, can also stand for anxiety, stress, and defense mode. Don't neglect these, they get overlooked all the time, and yet if we're always in fight, flight, or freeze mode, it creates problems. There's a lot of long-term issues. The only medicine I am on, the only medication prescription I take is for gastroparesis, because I've had so many years of anxiety trying to fit in with all you neurotypicals that my digestive system has just shut down almost permanently. And then in my 40s, I got diagnosed with lupus, all this inflammation. Again, I've known a lot of people with autism who have PTSD or OCD, again, as a side result of a lot of this. So how do you help with it? Well, you want to recognize the anxiety, stress, and defense mode, and not try to pull the person out of it until you can help reduce the overwhelm. This is a technique that Danny Rady talks about on his website. But you retreat, let the person retreat and recharge, and then you respectfully reach out to be able to help them redirect, reframe, and adjust as necessary. Again, if I had time, I'd go through more of that. Let me finally give you some tips and tools. And I call this my PACE. The P stands for purpose, priming, predictability, patience. Make sure that you always give a why, that you always prepare, that you make things predictable, and that you're patient with the person who's trying. Make sure that you take care of the antecedents, what's going on beforehand, and you notice what's going on before behaviors. Make sure you give choices, that you create visual aids and other supports, and that you help build real connection and affinity with that person and notice what they have connection with. Be consistent, be clear, have natural consequences, and always, always teach with compassion. Focus on the environment as much as you focus on the person. Make sure that you're giving them supports for their executive functioning. I went from a C student to an A student because one teacher said, "Oh, here's a blank calendar, just write down every class you take and what the homework is." And that was enough of a system for me that it worked. Expose them to lots of things so they don't get locked in. And remember that exceptionality is often a good thing. Accentuate their strengths and where they are. Awesome. Pace yourself. As Adam Schweibeck said, this is not a sprint, right? You need to cultivate a marathon mindset. Why? Because it gets better. There's a lot of cause for hope. As Tony Atwood says, we get overly pessimistic looking at kids with autism and thinking, oh gosh. But nobody ever takes their 1-month-old back to the doctor and says, "Doctor, I'm really concerned about this 1-month-old. They're not holding up their head, they're just screaming all the time, they have no verbal skills, they have no bladder and bowel control, you know." The doctor would just laugh them out of the office because we know it gets better over time. Well, autism does too. And the studies are showing that even if you've got intellectual disabilities, this study had more than 2/3 people with disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and they're getting better. And Harvard was shocked to discover that science is telling us autism's not a fixed life sentence. People improve. And some of those people do amazing things. And I'm not just talking about the cool people I know who work at Walmart. I'm talking about this as an acronym. These are writers like Pulitzer Prize winner Tim Page, these are diagnosed adults with autism. Actors like Oscar winner Anthony Hopkins, leisure and recreational people like Satoshi Tajiri, who invented Pokemon, musicians like Derek Parvicini, the human iPod, or artists like Stephen Wiltshire, the human camera, or research educational people like Nobel Prize winner Vernon Smith. And tons of tech people. Why are these people succeeding way outside of even what is normal for neurotypicals? Because of the strengths. They asked Anthony Hopkins, he got diagnosed in his 70s, and they asked him about his autism. He said, yeah, I think it's helped me as an actor. It didn't help my marriages. It hasn't helped my relationship with my daughter. But it has helped me as an actor because I do like to get inside people's heads, which is kind of creepy coming from Hannibal Lecter. Anyway, we have strengths, right? Research says we have great learning styles and memory and visual and auditory abilities, processing abilities, focus abilities, being able to be deductive, rational, logical, creative, being good with puzzles, routines, music, honesty, concern for children, plants, animals, deep curiosity. We tend to be idealistic. We can be leaders, albeit with bad communication skills. And we tend to be perfectionistic and have great skills with systemization. It's time to start looking at autism as an advantage in some spheres, says Dr. Matron. All right, so I was in Washington, D.C. for a Disabilities Council conference, and I was so proud of myself. I used all of my systems to get to the hotel from the airport and find my room and check in and get ready, and I had all my stuff, and I'm ready to go out and be part of this conference, and I get to the Renaissance Hotel in downtown Washington, D.C., and this is the carpet. I don't know how well you can see this, but oh my gosh, I walked in there and I just like pitched sideways. I was about to fall over. It was horrible. It was like the floor was just constantly doing this the entire conference, and I laughed because some things don't get better, but our systems do get better. And we're more likely to get better if we're having self-awareness, self-acceptance, self-advocacy systems, and support networks, right? Like we talked about earlier, self-awareness should lead to self-acceptance, should lead to self-advocacy, and eventually to self-determination, reliance, and self-esteem. But again, young people who even have minimal verbal skills are getting better and living happy lives with this stuff. I do a whole presentation on systems, but you need to help the person take their rigid routines and learn to use that power to create systematic routines to instead create systems that will allow them to do whatever task is in front of them and put that in their power. The other thing you want to do is create support networks as early as possible and then turn those over to the person. So the support network becomes something that they can control and they know who they're going to for what support or where. And they don't all have to be people, it can be other things too. Prepare for the cliffs. First cliff is when you hit 22 and you run out of IDEA funding, right, and all that stuff. Second cliff is when the parents can no longer care for the child. You need to prep for both these cliffs, and support networks are a huge piece of that. Finally, in conclusion, like Temple Grandin said, the thing about it is that you get less and less autistic because you keep learning. In other words, you seem less and less strange and you're more and more able to navigate. Not that our autism is less. Lydia Brown, she's an autistic advocate I really admire. She says, accept us just as we are and respect us. Support us so that we can maximize. Include us in all of your decisions. Nothing about us without us, and listen to us. My conclusions, like I said with preconceptions, you don't know how someone with autism is going to turn out. People who'd seen me back when I was a kid would be like probably shocked. I'm shocked some days. And I'm going to be shocked to see how a lot of my students turn out. I got a call the other day from a student who, in his 30s, was still melting down when someone took his seat in the classroom. And he said, hey, I'm getting married in April. And I was just in an Imagine Dragons video. I'm hit number 3 in the background. It was awesome. You don't know how things are going to turn out. We're people. So own your stereotypes and prejudices. Those are great little shortcuts. You don't have to be ashamed of your stereotypes and prejudices, but don't ever mistake them for reality. And always acknowledge that you've got them. Find ways for everybody, whether they're autistic or not, the people you work with, to do autonomy, competency, socially, contribution, and pace yourself throughout. Autism's not a death sentence. Yeah, it's lifelong. Yeah, it's not going to go away, but it does get better as we learn to deal with it. And all those little kids you're dealing with and helping and loving are going to grow up to be adults with autism. So help them build those skills. Help them build that resiliency. Expose them gradually to things. Help them not isolate. And customize the interventions, because there's not any one intervention that's perfect for everybody. Right? Whatever intervention you're using, Make sure that you're doing it right and for the right reasons. Because the right therapy done wrong can be worse than no therapy at all. Remember that autism is important, but it's just one piece of who we are. And autism doesn't define us. We get to define our autism. If you ask Temple Grandin how she defines herself, she's a scientist and a professor first. Autism is like 2 or 3 on her list. And when we're autistic, again, there are days when I wish I didn't have autism. There are moments where it's really hard. There are times when, no, it's actually really great and I'm thankful for it. But guess what? Everybody else has days like that too. We're not all that different. So even if you can't fix us, at least try to accept us and celebrate the fact that just because we step outside the norm doesn't make us wrong. Our uniqueness can be an amazing benefit for all of society and certainly a source of strength and pride for us personally. So value our lived experience. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Wasn't that amazing? I just have a quick note before you move